Welcome to this immersive journey into the grim realities of medieval justice. If you enjoy slow, informative historical storytelling that helps you drift off while learning something fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and settle in. Tonight, we'll be exploring what actually happened when someone got arrested in the Middle Ages. Spoiler: it wasn't as simple as being taken to jail and waiting for a fair trial. Let's begin with a very basic idea that often goes overlooked. In the medieval world, being arrested didn't mean you were proven guilty, but it definitely meant your life had taken a terrifying turn. The idea of being innocent until proven guilty did not exist in most places during this time. Being arrested, for many, was the beginning of a physical, mental, and social descent. It was often public. It was humiliating. And for some, it ended in death before a sentence was ever officially declared. The concept of law enforcement in medieval Europe wasn't centralized. Most communities had a constable or perhaps a manor court officer responsible for apprehending suspects. These weren't trained police officers, and they didn't need a warrant or any formal evidence to arrest someone. If someone pointed a finger at you and they had the right standing, you could be taken into custody immediately. False accusations were common, especially in rural communities where grudges could fester for generations. When someone was arrested, it wasn't a quiet, orderly event. There were no rights read, no legal protections activated. Instead, you might be grabbed in the street, pulled from your home, or taken during a public gathering. Resisting arrest was dangerous. It could lead to being beaten, chained, or worse, especially if your accuser was someone of status. Once in custody, you weren't brought to a clean, modern jail. You were usually taken to a holding cell, castle dungeon, or stone chamber, whichever facility was available nearby. These spaces were not meant to be comfortable or humane. There was no concept of rehabilitation, only containment. The idea was simple: keep you locked up until the authorities decided what would happen to you. That decision could take hours or months. Some prisoners were chained to the wall. Others were confined with multiple people in dark, airless rooms with little to no sanitation. There was often no bedding, only cold stone floors and possibly straw. Rats, lice, and fleas were common companions. The air was stale, damp, and heavy, with the smell of waste. And yet, this was only the beginning. You might have been told your crime, or you might not. Communication between the authorities and the arrested was minimal. In many regions, especially where literacy was low, you were simply thrown into confinement while local officials decided whether your case was worth pursuing. Evidence wasn't collected in the modern sense. Sometimes your guilt was determined by how suspicious you looked or how much someone disliked you. And remember, medieval systems operated heavily on public reputation. If you were an outsider, poor, a foreigner, or simply someone without powerful friends, you were at greater risk of being kept in confinement longer and treated worse. This wasn't just physical imprisonment. It was the slow crushing of autonomy, identity, and hope. In the eyes of many communities, once you were arrested, you were already halfway to being condemned. The rest was just a matter of how long you could survive in the meantime. What happened next? Did someone come to question you? Was there any formal process for explaining yourself? In the next segment, we'll explore how prisoners were processed or ignored after arrest, and what decided whether you'd wait days or years to see a courtroom. There were no clocks, no schedules, no idea when or if someone would return. Once locked up, medieval prisoners essentially became invisible, unless someone had a vested interest in you: family, a local noble, or a particularly thorough bailiff. You could be left to rot. Quite literally. Let's make one thing clear: you were not entitled to a trial. In fact, in many places, there wasn't a formal process in place at all. The authorities could interrogate you today or next year. You could be summoned to a manor court next week, or they might wait for the seasonal circuit judge who only visited once a year. Until then, Your life existed in a kind of legal limbo. Food? If your family didn't bring it, you might not eat. Water? Maybe, but only if the jailer remembered. And even then, it might be stagnant or foul. Some prisoners drank rainwater that seeped in through cracks in the stone ceiling. Others relied on charity, an occasional crust tossed in by a passing monk or pitying servant. The darkness began to get to people first. Medieval dungeons weren't equipped with torches or lamps. Candles were a luxury. Most cells were underground. No windows, no air circulation. The only sound was the scrape of rats, the cough of another prisoner, or the muffled cries echoing from somewhere deeper in the prison. Days blended into nights, and nights into a timeless void. And then, there, were the smells that a cell was a place where waste accumulated, where illness lingered in the air, and where straw bedding decayed over weeks. Many prisoners defecated in the corners of their cells. The bucket, if there was one, was rarely emptied. If you were unlucky enough to have a wound or fever, the chances of recovery were slim. Gangrene, lice infestations, and vomiting from infected food were common and deadly. Now, let's say you weren't alone. Shared cells were common, especially in busy towns or cities. You might be locked in with 4, 5, even 10 others, and there were no classifications. A petty thief might share a cell with a murderer or an unhinged drunk. Violence among prisoners was frequent, especially when food was tossed in. If you were weak or quiet, you were likely to go hungry. You see, there were no guards stationed. Inside, only the heavy doors separated you from the outside world, and it was only opened when someone had a reason. Until then, disputes were handled by the prisoners themselves. That meant fighting over space, over food, over sanity. After several days or weeks, someone might finally show up, a constable, a steward, a court clerk, but they weren't there to help. They had questions, or maybe they just wanted to see if you were still alive. There was no promise they'd return. They might scribble something on a wax tablet or parchment, or they might walk away in silence. What came next depended on many things. How serious was your alleged crime? Did anyone important want you tried? Was there room on the next court docket? Could you pay a fee or bribe to accelerate the process? Yes, money could absolutely shorten your time. Not always legally, but efficiently. A silver penny here, a favor called in there, and suddenly your name might rise to the top of a judge's list. But if you had nothing, you waited and waited. Psychological decay was often more damaging than starvation. Time lost meaning. Prisoners reported hallucinations, nightmares, and disconnection from reality. One might forget their own name, or believe themselves already dead. Medieval texts speak of prisoners driven mad by the waiting, mumbling, scratching the walls, or attacking cellmates in bursts of panic. Some tried to plead with guards, but guards weren't there to mediate. Their job was containment, not compassion. You could beg, you could cry, but most simply learned to endure, or stop trying altogether. Some would be released without trial, if a landowner took pity or the accusation was quietly dropped. Others were forgotten entirely. And then, every so often, the door would open and the next phase would begin. Interrogation.it could be a conversation. It could be a beating. It could be both. But one thing was certain, it was never voluntary. The sound of iron hinges groaning open pulls you from a shallow sleep. For a moment, you don't know where you are. The walls look the same. The floor feels the same, cold, uneven, and wet. But something has changed. Two figures stand in the doorway. One carries a torch. The other has a rope in hand. They don't speak. They don't explain. You are pulled to your feet and led down a corridor so narrow you can touch both walls with outstretched arms. It's time. The interrogation chamber is not the dimly lit torture room of Hollywood fantasy, but it is no less chilling. It might be a vaulted cellar beneath a courthouse, a side room in a manor, or a modified stable. The tools vary, the locations vary, but the goal does not. Extract a confession. The question of guilt is secondary. In many regions of medieval Europe, particularly under inquisitorial systems or Roman-influenced law, a confession was the gold standard of evidence. Without it, a case might remain in limbo. With it, punishment was not just possible, it was inevitable. The process began with questioning. At first, this might seem civil. A notary might be present to record your responses. A clerk would observe. The questions would come from a constable, a steward, or a judge. They wanted to know what happened. Why were you seen at the market the night of the theft? Who did you speak to? Where were you after dark? Sometimes they offered you wine or bread, as if to encourage trust. Sometimes they asked the same question 5 times, watching for inconsistencies that if you denied everything, the tone changed. Repeated denial was seen not as a declaration of innocence, but as resistance. And resistance, they believed, only meant one thing. You were hiding something. That's when coercion started. The medieval understanding of truth was physical. Pain revealed truth. Fear revealed guilt. The logic was brutal and circular. If you confessed, you were guilty. If you didn't confess, they hadn't yet hurt you enough. This led to one of the most infamous aspects of medieval justice: sanctioned torture. There was a procedure for this, particularly after the 13th century. Torture wasn't applied randomly. A judge or bailiff had to authorize it. The suspect had to be formally accused of a serious crime: murder, heresy, treason, or repeated theft. And, in many jurisdictions, there had to be some other form of evidence: a witness account, possession of stolen goods, or flight from the scene. But once authorized, it began swiftly. The first level was psychological. You might be shown the instruments: a rack, thumb screws, or the strappato, a pulley device used to suspend prisoners by their arms, tied behind their back. The goal was to terrify you into confessing before a finger was laid. In some cases, this worked, but many held firm, hoping that silence might earn mercy. Then came the physical pain. The strappato was common across much of Europe. You were hoisted into the air by your arms, which were bound behind you. The strain on your shoulders was excruciating. If they dropped you just a foot or two, your shoulders dislocated. Some prisoners passed out immediately. Others screamed until they couldn't breathe. The rack was rarer but devastating. You were laid flat, wrists and ankles tied to rollers. Slowly, deliberately, the rollers were turned, stretching your body beyond its limits. Ligaments tore. Muscles split. In some cases, bones cracked. Again, the goal wasn't to kill. It was to extract the words, "Yes, I did it." Then there were more intimate tortures: thumbs pressed in iron vices, toes crushed under boards, heated pliers applied to the soles of feet. Each method had its purpose, its rhythm. The interrogators believed themselves technicians of truth, adjusting pressure as needed. And throughout it all, a clerk or notary recorded your answers, or your screams. But not every region used torture. In England, for example, formal use of torture required a royal warrant and was much rarer than on the continent. Instead, they used confinement itself as pressure: starvation, sleep deprivation, isolation. Inquisitorial systems in France, Italy, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire were more likely to employ methodical physical coercion. Interrogation in the Middle Ages was never a one-size-fits-all ordeal. The experience varied dramatically depending on where you were, your social status, and the specific crime you were accused of. A minor thief might be spared the rack, but still face days of deprivation and isolation. A suspected heretic in 14th century Toulouse could find themselves under the scrutiny of Dominican inquisitors, where psychological pressure was an art form. As much as physical pain, let's look deeper into the variations. In the German territories of the Holy Roman Empire, torture was codified into local legal traditions through what was known as the Carolina Code of 1532. This document, issued by Emperor Charles V, attempted to standardize the use of torture under strict regulations. In theory, it could only be used with half-proofs, evidence that strongly suggested guilt but wasn't yet conclusive. In practice, those definitions were flexible. If your neighbors testified against you, or you had been caught fleeing, it was often enough. One notorious device in German-speaking lands was the Schandmantel, or shame cloak, a heavy iron contraption worn like a robe, used for public humiliation and psychological torment before harsher methods began. In other areas, such as Spain or Italy, the Inquisition wielded a terrifying degree of authority. Suspects could be held for months before being told what they were even accused of. Torture was permitted if the inquisitors believed the soul of the accused was in peril. And then there were local improvisations, interrogation tools and methods that never made it into the legal codes. Heated irons were common, as were Spanish boots, which crushed the calves and ankles with wooden wedges. Some cities, like Florence, were known for their meticulous record-keeping during interrogations, with transcripts detailing every question and every scream. Others left no record at all. The torment wasn't confined to your body. Your mind was under siege too. Some cells were specially designed for psychological disorientation. Windows placed high and small to deny a sense of time. Echoing walls. Dungeons where no human voice could reach you. The deprivation of sleep was especially effective. Interrogators would burst in repeatedly at random intervals, denying you the chance to rest, keeping you in a haze of exhaustion. Some suspects confessed to anything just to be allowed to sleep. What's perhaps most disturbing is how methodical and bureaucratic it all was. Torture was not administered in a rage. It was often executed by professionals, men who saw themselves as enforcers of order and truth. They used scripts, checklists, even time limits. A bailiff might order 10 minutes on the strappado, and the torturer would comply with clinical detachment. Torture sessions were sometimes supervised by clerics or magistrates, ensuring the letter of the law was followed, even as it broke the spirit. But even among professionals, abuse occurred. Some torturers were known for their cruelty and sought out for it. In cities like Paris or Bruges, executioners sometimes doubled as interrogators, and their reputations preceded them. People spoke in hushed tones about Pierre the Hook, or the Iron Master of Liège, men whose names were synonymous with agony. Despite the brutality, there were rules. For example, you could not be tortured twice for the same crime, unless, of course, new evidence came forward. In practice, this meant that many suspects were tortured multiple times, each justified by a new lead or contradiction in their previous statements. And once your confession was obtained, there was no appeals process. You had said the words. The rest was paperwork. That it's worth noting that women, children, and the elderly were not always spared. Although some regions prohibited the torture of pregnant women or those over a certain age, exceptions were made. A woman accused of witchcraft could be tortured even while visibly expecting a child, especially during the height of the witch trials in Central Europe. Children as young as 12 were sometimes subjected to the rack or vice grips in cases involving theft, blasphemy, or alleged demonic activity. Some prisoners tried to resist by using silence, passivity, or even self-harm. There are accounts of suspects biting off their tongues or smashing their heads against stone walls to avoid giving up names or confessions. Others whispered confessions in hopes that they wouldn't be understood. A few were known to laugh through their pain, unnerving their captors. But for most, resistance was a slow erosion, not a burst of defiance. Day after day, hour after hour, they cracked, and when they finally spoke, when they muttered yes or signed the parchment with a trembling mark, the room shifted. The pain didn't end, but the purpose did. You were now a convict, and the next phase of your journey through medieval justice was ready to begin: public sentencing and punishment. The words have been spoken, or perhaps they were whispered through broken teeth after hours of agony. Either way, the confession is done. Your captors no longer see you as a suspect. They see you as a criminal. And in the medieval world, that shift came with terrifying consequences. Justice, now, would not be quiet. It would not be private. It would be public, deliberate, and, most of all, humiliating. Once your confession had been accepted, it was documented. A notary or clerk wrote it in formal Latin or the vernacular language of the court, depending on the region. Your name, your crime, and your words were all recorded. You were now part of the official ledger of justice. That document would follow you, sometimes even nailed beside you on the day of your punishment. Sentencing was the next step. In many cases, you wouldn't even be present when it happened. A council of judges, a bailiff, or a baron might read your confession and decide your fate in a chamber far from your cell. Sometimes, if the case was especially notorious, the sentence would be delivered with fanfare, publicly, from a balcony or in front of the church. The idea was to make an example out of you, and there were many ways to do that, for crimes considered minor, like petty theft, gossiping, minor fraud. The punishment was usually public shaming. But don't mistake that for leniency. Shaming in the medieval world was harsh, theatrical, and cruel. You might be paraded through the streets in a cart, with signs hanging from your neck describing your crimes. Villagers would throw filth, rotten vegetables, dung, or worse. Sometimes your hair would be shaved off. Sometimes you'd be forced to wear ridiculous clothing, a man who impersonated. Then there was the pillory, a wooden frame, often placed in the busiest square, where your head and hands would be locked in place for hours, sometimes days. Rain, heat, jeering crowds, and flying objects were all part of the experience. If someone took pity and gave you water, they could be fined. It was meant to break your pride, expose you, and humiliate you beyond the pain of torture. Many prisoners said this was worse. Branding was also common. Thieves might be marked with a T on the hand or cheek. Prostitutes were branded in some cities. In France, galley slaves were burned with the royal fleur-de-lis. The idea was to let society punish you forever. Branding was a lifelong sentence. You could never hide again, but if your crime was serious, murder, heresy, treason, or repeated offenses, the punishment moved to a new level, physical and permanent. Mutilation was one such route. A thief might lose a hand. A liar might lose a tongue. An arsonist could have fingers or ears removed. These punishments were often done in public, on a scaffold. A hooded executioner, a roaring crowd, and your own blood staining the wood. For the most extreme cases, the sentence was death, but not always swift. Hanging was the most common method for ordinary criminals. It was both punishment and performance. The condemned would be led through town, surrounded by guards. Clergy might follow, offering last rites. At the gallows, the sentence was read again, so no one missed the reason for your fate. The noose was placed, the trapdoor opened, or the cart pulled, and justice was delivered. Not always cleanly. Many died slowly, choking and twitching for minutes before silence. Beheading was reserved for nobility or those of higher status. A swift blow from a sword or axe, if the executioner was skilled. But skill varied. Some required 2 or 3 strikes. Heads sometimes rolled into the crowd. It was a spectacle meant to burn itself into memory. Burning at the stake, though rare, was reserved for crimes like heresy, witchcraft, or severe treason. The condemned would be tied to a post, often with bundles of kindling stacked around their feet and waist. The executioner lit the flames with a torch, and the fire did the rest. Some cities offered a mercy, strangulation before the fire truly caught, but not always. Across all these punishments, one theme remained constant. They were meant to be seen. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't hidden behind courtroom doors. It was public, moral, and symbolic. The community didn't just observe justice, they participated in it. By mocking you, throwing things, or even spitting, the people confirmed the social order. They were inside it, and you were outside it. And yet, Even amid this cruelty, there were cracks, moments of pity. A child might cry when watching their parent lashed in the square. A priest might whisper words of comfort. A stranger might slip you a sip of water in the pillory, risking a fine. Medieval justice was brutal, but it was also human. And in those rare moments, the line between punishment and redemption blurred. As you stood there, branded, bleeding, or awaiting the gallows, you weren't just a criminal. You were part of a system far larger than yourself. A system that believed pain purified, shame corrected, and death silenced. But the story doesn't end here. What happened after the punishment? Could you return to life? Could you escape the mark of your past? Could you vanish and start over? Or would society keep dragging you back to the scaffold, even if only in memory? That's the next chapter in your medieval nightmare. The punishment is over. The crowd has scattered. The pillory stands empty. Maybe your wounds are healing, or maybe you're learning to live without the hand that was taken from you. The sentence has been carried out, but your life, as it was before, may be permanently gone. In medieval Europe, there was no such thing as a clean slate. Criminal records weren't stored in databases or locked away in dusty archives. Your record walked with you, carved into your skin, burned into your face, or whispered in every marketplace you entered. If you'd been branded, the mark made you instantly recognizable. If you'd been pilloried or publicly flogged, your neighbors had seen it. No one forgot. Returning to normal life was not guaranteed. In fact, it was rare. Let's say you were a commoner, a laborer, a craftsman, a servant. After your punishment, you might attempt to return to your old job, but your employer would hesitate. Would customers trust a branded thief to handle their money? Would a farmer let you near his tools? Even if someone pitted you, employing a criminal could bring shame or suspicion on their household. Family was another question. In some cases, families welcomed punished relatives back, especially if they were young or the punishment was light. But in many others, people were quietly cast out. Siblings refused to share inheritance. Parents disowned children. The weight of disgrace mattered more than forgiveness. Some people had no home to return to. If you'd committed a crime in a small village, the gossip would have spread far and fast. You might be asked, formally or otherwise, to leave. Some towns issued informal exile. You were not technically banished, but no one would trade with you, house you, or speak your name aloud. You became a ghost among people you once knew. What options were left? Some turned to begging. Branded beggars were common in larger towns, especially at churches, bridges, or gates where travelers passed. Others joined traveling groups of misfits, criminals, or wandering traders. Medieval society had a place, albeit a precarious one, for such people. But these communities were marginal, and life within them was brutal. A few became permanent outlaws, surviving in forests, robbing roads, or drifting from town to town under new names. Branding and mutilation made this harder. You were easy to identify. Some tried to hide their scars with scarves, cloaks, or mud. Others leaned into the fear their marks inspired, becoming gang leaders or feared figures on the edge of society. Rehabilitation, what we now call reintegration, was extremely rare. There were few programs, few chances, and little institutional support. Some religious institutions offered aid. Monasteries occasionally took in the disgraced, especially if penance was expressed sincerely. But even this path was difficult. You had to convince the church you were worth saving. Women faced a different set of challenges. A woman branded or punished for moral crimes, especially adultery, prostitution, or illegitimacy, was often forced into the margins. In some cases, she was married off quickly to avoid scandal. In others, she was barred from marriage entirely, doomed to isolation or religious service. Children of punished parents inherited stigma too. If your father had been hanged or your mother branded, it followed you like a shadow. People whispered. Prospective spouses vanished. Guilds refused entry. For generations, a family name could be tainted. Some punished people tried to reinvent themselves, fleeing to faraway towns where no one knew them. This worked sometimes, but if you were ever recognized, or if someone found your mark, the punishment would return, this time through community suspicion. You might be accused of new crimes just because of your past. Justice didn't sleep, and it didn't forget. There were a few exceptional stories. Criminals turned heroes. A former thief who defended a town against raiders. A disgraced soldier who helped rebuild a village. These stories existed, but they were rare and usually retold in legend, not in daily life. What most faced was social limbo. You weren't in prison, but you weren't free. You weren't hanged, but you weren't alive in the full sense of the word. Every door you knocked on, every job you sought, every street you crossed, your past came first. It walked ahead of you, spoke before you opened your mouth. In a world built on hierarchy, stability, and faith, punishment didn't end with pain. It lingered in your scars, your reputation, and your future. You might eat again. You might sleep under a roof again. But you were no longer part of the body of the village. You were the wound. And no matter how clean you tried to become, the scar remained. In medieval Europe, fear wasn't just the consequence of punishment. It was the system's most efficient tool. The mere threat of humiliation, torture, or execution was often enough to keep entire communities obedient, not because they had seen it happen to themselves, but because they had seen it happen to others. You didn't need to be guilty to be afraid. Let's start with the streets. When you walked past the market square and saw the pillory, empty or occupied, it wasn't just a place for criminals. It was a message board, a living warning. The town didn't hide its punishments. They displayed them. Executions were held in public. Floggings were timed with market days for maximum visibility. Stocks were placed outside the church so that every God-fearing villager would see what awaited the disobedient. Children grew up watching these things. They didn't just learn morality from scripture or their parents. They learned from the sound of a whip against flesh, from the awkward silence that followed the executioner's axe, from the hush that fell over a crowd when someone was dragged, half-conscious, through the street in chains. Even if you were innocent, especially if you were innocent, you lived in anticipation of guilt. You monitored your behavior. You watched your words. You made sure you didn't associate with the wrong people, didn't speak against the wrong customs, didn't linger in the wrong places. Because in a world without modern policing, fear was a cheaper and more effective alternative to surveillance. The church added another layer to this. Spiritual fear. Eternal consequences. You weren't just punished on earth, your soul could burn for eternity. If the public gallows scared your body, sermons scared your heart. Priests preached hellfire not only for heretics, but for disobedient children, unfaithful spouses, or neighbors who dared to skip confession. Even thinking sinful thoughts was cause for panic. So people self-policed. You didn't need guards in every village or a constable at every corner. You just needed people to believe that stepping out of line meant humiliation, mutilation, or damnation, or all three. It created a society where fear kept the gears turning. Rumors became another mechanism. You heard about what happened in the next village. A boy whipped for stealing grain, a woman drowned for infidelity. You didn't know if it was true, but it didn't matter. The story was enough. It seeded doubt, caution, obedience. What's more, punishment didn't always come from above. Often, it came from the people around you. Collective enforcement, mob justice. Your neighbors could decide your fate long before any official ever got involved. Guilt by association was common. If your cousin stole from a merchant, you might find your own stall empty of customers. If someone claimed you spoke against the local lord, you could be questioned, or worse, by nightfall. In this way, fear wasn't limited to criminals. It stretched like a shadow over everyone. The baker who weighed his loaves carefully, lest someone accuse him of shorting flour. The blacksmith who always greeted the priest first. The girl who covered her head not just for modesty, but to avoid suspicion of vanity or pride. Even humor was dangerous. A joke at the wrong time, a smile during a sermon, a look interpreted as defiance. These could snowball. You never knew who might report you. And once a charge was laid, even if you were innocent, your life could spiral into scrutiny. Interrogation didn't require hard evidence. Fear filled in the gaps. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this fear was how normalized it was. People didn't think of it as oppression. They thought of it as order. Necessary. Divine. To live in fear was to live rightly, aware of your sins, your station, your fragility in the eyes of God and crown. Comfort was dangerous. Confidence could lead to arrogance. So fear remained, generation after generation, a quiet law unto itself that it shaped how you walked, how you prayed, how you ate, how you dreamed, and most of the time, it worked. Imagine this. You wake up before dawn, like always. You feed the animals, collect water, and stoke the fire. It's a day like any other, until you hear a knock at the door, and behind that door, two men with questions. Someone said you stole something. Someone said you cursed a neighbor's crops. Someone said they heard you utter words that sounded unnatural. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe it was a lie. Maybe it was envy or politics or bad timing. It didn't matter that in the medieval world, accusation itself was a force, and it didn't need to be supported by physical evidence or legal proof. Just a few voices, or even one, could trigger an investigation. A priest, a landlord, a merchant, a jealous sibling, a rival for inheritance. Your entire fate could turn on the words of someone you'd never even wronged. The line between rumor and crime was razor thin. In a society built on spoken word and shared suspicion, people listened closely. And they remembered. Had you been distant lately? Had you muttered to yourself while walking home? Had you spoken sharply to the wrong person in a public setting? Any of these could snowball into something dangerous. Once enough doubt was cast on your name, the legal process, or its informal equivalent, could begin, and it was swift. You could be detained and questioned, or hauled before a local magistrate or church authority. The mere association with wrongdoing created a stigma. Neighbors looked away. Friends stopped speaking. Even your family might hesitate, unsure of whether your guilt could stain them too. Trials varied by region, but many were terrifyingly simple. You might be asked to swear an oath of innocence. If no one would swear on your behalf, a system called compurgation, your silence could be seen as guilt. In other cases, you could be subjected to ordeals, plunging your hand into boiling water to see if God would protect you, or walking over hot iron. If you healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, punishment followed. But even if no formal ordeal was used, the outcome often came down to influence and perception. If your accuser was wealthy, respected, or connected to the church, their words weighed more than yours. If you were an outsider, a traveler, a recent settler, or simply odd, your defense might be ignored. The terrifying part? No one was safe. Being pious didn't protect you. Having a clean record didn't matter. In fact, the higher your reputation, the more dramatic your fall could be. And if someone wanted you ruined, for land, money, revenge, or control, an accusation was the easiest weapon. Once you were accused, life changed instantly. If you worked in the market, customers vanished. If you had apprentices, they were pulled away by their families. If you were a woman, your virtue was questioned. If you were a man, your honesty and honor were put on trial. And once doubt entered the community, even complete exoneration might not erase it. Some people fled, disappearing in the night, leaving behind homes and possessions. Others submitted, hoping their innocence would shine through. But in a world where fear ruled and public opinion was malleable, justice was often less about truth and more about appearances. You didn't need to be guilty, you just needed to be convenient. You weren't meant to live long in a medieval prison. Prisons, as we imagine them today, with cells, guards, regular meals, and trials, simply didn't exist for most people in the Middle Ages. There were dungeons, towers, and dark basements. In castles and city halls, yes, but those weren't places to serve time. They were places to be forgotten. Being locked up wasn't a punishment. It was a delay, a limbo between accusation and whatever came next. And sometimes, nothing came next at all. Let's say you've been accused, fairly or not. Theft, sorcery, treason, blasphemy, pick your poison. You've been arrested, dragged through the mud, perhaps beaten for resistance, and then dropped into a cell. That cell could be underground. No light, no proper air, no bed. Just stone, dampness, and the sounds of others. Rats, prisoners, or worse, there's no guarantee that anyone will bring food. If your family or friends bring it to you, perhaps you'll eat. If not, you go hungry. In many towns, prisoners were expected to pay for their own upkeep. Food, blankets, even chains. Can't afford it? Starve. You wait. You don't know if you'll be executed. You don't know if you'll be fined. You don't know if someone just needed you out of the way. Days pass, then weeks. The filth builds. You are chained to a wall or to the ankle of another prisoner. There's no privacy, no hygiene. Your wounds fester. The straw beneath you is soaked with urine, your own or someone else's. You hear others come in. Some scream, some beg, some never say a word, and some simply disappear, taken out during the night, never seen again. You listen for footsteps, for keys, for your name. Maybe someone lied about you. Maybe your enemy has bribed the magistrate. Maybe your case was forgotten in a pile of papers. None of it matters anymore. Time stops. You begin to lose track of the days. There are no windows, no voices you recognize. The walls start closing in, or perhaps your mind does. You hallucinate. You talk to the rats. You try to remember what sunshine felt like. Others die in their cells. From infection, from madness, from the simple absence of water. Corpses are dragged out once in a while, or left to rot until the smell becomes too much. You realize that your punishment isn't death. It's waiting for it. Some people spent months, even years, in these holding cells. Not because they were guilty, but because no one could be bothered to resolve their case. Or because someone important wanted them to suffer. And if you were finally released, you emerged a different person. Starved, shaken, scarred by darkness and silence. You were no longer who you were when you entered. And if you were executed, sometimes it came almost as a mercy. The real punishment was being trapped between hope and despair. In modern times, we instinctively draw a line between adults and children in matters of justice. We believe, at least on paper, that minors should be protected, taught, and rehabilitated rather than punished like hardened criminals. But in the Middle Ages, this line barely existed. To be born into a medieval society was, from the outset, to be exposed to hardship. Survival itself was uncertain. Nearly half of all children didn't make it to adulthood. Those who did were expected to work, obey, and conform. There was no concept of a childhood as we know it today. No protected period of innocence. No clear legal buffer. You were simply a smaller human being held to many of the same expectations as everyone else. If you were old enough to steal, you were old enough to suffer the consequences. Let's start with the reality of labor. By the age of 5 or 6, most children were already working in the fields, in homes, or apprenticed to tradesmen. By 10 or 11, many were sent to live with other families as servants or workers. They were subject to discipline from adults other than their parents, and discipline could be brutal. A child who disobeyed a master could be beaten, starved, or cast out. And if that master was influential, the child's family often had no means to object. Now, imagine a 10-year-old stealing a loaf of bread because he hadn't eaten in 2 days. In some villages, he might be whipped in public. In others, placed in the stocks to be mocked and pelted by neighbors. But in cities with more formal systems, that same child might be arrested and jailed alongside grown men. There are documented cases of children as young as 7 being imprisoned or even executed for crimes ranging from theft to arson. The judicial records from medieval England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire paint a grim picture. Children accused of petty theft, trespassing, or disrupting the peace were processed through the same mechanisms as adults. A boy who accidentally killed another while playing with a knife could be charged with manslaughter. A girl accused of lying under oath might face public humiliation or banishment. Execution was rare, but not unthinkable. In some parts of Europe, during certain periods, the age of criminal responsibility was as low as 7 years old. That meant a child could be held fully accountable for their actions, not in the eyes of morality, but in the eyes of the law. Some children were hanged, others were burned. Many more were maimed, branded on the hand, ear, or cheek as permanent markers of guilt. One boy, barely 12, was accused of setting fire to a barn in a rural English village. Whether he did it out of curiosity, malice, or accident was irrelevant. He was tied to a cart, whipped through the streets, and left scarred for life. Not just physically, but socially. No one would apprentice him. No one would employ him. The punishment extended beyond the beating. It destroyed his future. And it wasn't just boys. Young girls were often subjected to moral scrutiny beyond their years. A girl who dressed immodestly or was suspected of flirting outside her social class could find herself labeled a prostitute or temptress. Punishments included head shaving, flogging, and public shame. Worse, many young girls were married, off before their teens, and once married, they were treated by law as adult women. That meant any defiance, infidelity, or challenge to authority was grounds for severe penalty. Children were also used in punishment in some towns. Children were required to witness public executions. This wasn't to traumatize them, at least. Not intentionally, but to educate them. Authorities believed that seeing the consequences of crime firsthand would deter future disobedience. So a 7-year-old might be marched out to the town square to watch a thief have his hand cut off. Or a group of school children might be brought to witness a woman burned for heresy. Imagine growing up with that as your lesson plan. Not if you were orphaned. Life was even more brutal. Without a family to protect you or advocate for your innocence, you were at the mercy of the town or church. Many orphan children were arrested simply for wandering, begging, or scavenging food, with no name, no money, and no adult to speak. For you, you could be locked away for being a vagrant. And if you died in custody, which many did, no one asked questions. Some monasteries took in young boys as novices. This might seem like a refuge, but even within religious walls, discipline was harsh. Beatings, fasting, isolation, these were considered appropriate methods to curb childish behavior. The idea of spiritual formation sometimes meant psychological damage. Even education was laced with violence. In schools attached to cathedrals or universities, corporal punishment was standard. A wrong answer, inattentiveness, or even a badly written letter could earn you a beating from a wooden rod. These punishments weren't considered abuse. They were seen as shaping the child's soul. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of all this was how normal it seemed. There was little protest, little debate. Children were seen as extensions of the adult world, expected to contribute, obey, and suffer as needed. Compassion existed, but it was inconsistent. You might be lucky enough to find a kind master, a generous priest, or a sympathetic judge, but those were exceptions, not the rule. And yet, children endured. They played when they could, laughed when no one was watching, and clung to joy in small corners of a brutal world. But the system itself? It was indifferent. You were small, vulnerable, and replaceable. And if you stepped out of line, there was no safety net that anyone would say, he's just a kid. Because in the eyes of medieval justice, you weren't. In a world before science, before public education, before rational medicine or verified news, People turned to what they knew: signs, omens, old stories, and fear. Medieval life was not just harsh physically, it was haunted mentally. Fear wasn't abstract, it was constant, and it shaped every action you took. One misplaced word, one strange illness, one unlucky animal crossing your path could be taken as a sign of something dark. You didn't need to be guilty of anything. Suspicion alone could bring ruin. Let's begin with your morning. You wake up to birds chirping, but not the right birds. A crow sits on the roof, cawing 3 times before flying off. Your neighbor's face darkens. That's not a good sign, she says. And suddenly, everything you do that day is tinged with unease. Superstition wasn't silly to people. It was law, not written down, but enforced by the entire community. Say you dropped bread butter side down on the floor. Say you sneezed 3 times before breakfast. Say you found your cow dead for no reason. Each of these moments could spiral into full-blown suspicion. Most people couldn't read or write. They didn't understand germs, natural disasters, or psychological disorders. So they filled the gaps in knowledge with old explanations: spirits, curses, demons, divine wrath. And these weren't metaphors. They were believed to be real, present forces in daily life. A woman with a crooked back and a black cat? Witch. A man who talked to himself? Possessed. A child who survived a fever. Others died from. Marked if you were too lucky, too strange, too silent, or too sick. You might be blamed for something that had nothing to do with you. Superstition fed into real, deadly consequences. Take the case of the evil eye, the idea that someone could curse you with a glance. It was believed that envy alone had power. If your crops failed, if your child died, or your horse went lame, you could blame a neighbor for casting a look. Entire fights broke out, sometimes resulting in beatings, imprisonment, or worse, simply over suspicions that someone looked at someone else the wrong way. Or consider storms. A thunderclap could be God's warning that someone in the village was hiding sin. A sudden illness might be interpreted as punishment for secret crimes. People rushed to confession out of fear of being the unknowing cause of a community-wide curse. Even birth defects or strange weather were signs. A child born with a limb missing? A bad omen, perhaps even a changeling, swapped by fairies. A woman who had twins might be whispered about behind her back. 2 souls in one womb. That's not natural. You could lose your standing, your livelihood, or your life because of things beyond your control. There was no scientific defense, only your word. And when fear took over, your word meant little. You couldn't just say, "That's not true." That wasn't enough, because the community would choose safety over fairness every time. And so, people created superstitious rituals to protect themselves. Farmers buried nails at the corners of their fields to ward off witches. Mothers tied red strings to their babies' wrists to confuse evil spirits. Villagers burned herbs, sang charms, or avoided walking under the same window twice. These weren't quirks. They were survival strategies. Even churchgoers mixed Christian rituals with older beliefs. A priest might bless holy water, but then a grandmother would stir it with a bone from her dead husband's grave, just to be sure. A cross might hang on the wall beside a dried snake's skin, both protecting the household in different ways. If something bad happened and you couldn't explain it, you had to look for a target. During the Black Death, thousands of people, especially Jews, beggars, foreigners, and women, were murdered not because they caused the plague, but because they were different. Their difference alone was interpreted as evidence. Think of how terrifying that is, to live in a world where an accident, an animal, or your own success could be twisted into proof of guilt, as so you kept your head down. You didn't laugh too loudly. You didn't brag. You didn't question why lightning struck one house and not another. Because if you stood out, you could be accused. And if you were accused, it rarely ended well. This web of fear, suspicion, and old beliefs wrapped itself around every person. In every village, from the richest landowner to the humblest servant. It shaped justice, love, death, and life itself. And even when laws tried to modernize, the superstitions remained stronger, in many cases, than faith or reason, because, in a world without explanations, fear was the only truth people trusted. In the medieval world, punishment was not only a matter of legal decree, but a public spectacle designed to mark a person for life. Once a sentence had been passed, and in many cases the sentence was meted out without a formal trial, the branded individual was forced to carry with them a permanent reminder of their guilt on their very flesh. To be branded was to have one's shame and supposed wrongdoing seared into the skin for all to see, and it was a punishment that went far beyond the immediate physical pain. It altered one's entire social existence. Imagine, for a moment, that you have been condemned by your community, not simply for a single misdeed, but for a pattern of behavior, for a transgression that your peers deemed unforgivable. The method chosen to punish you is branding, a cruel process in which an iron, heated until it glows red, is pressed against your skin. The heat is unimaginable, and the searing pain is acute. In that agonizing moment, your flesh is permanently marked with a letter or symbol that signifies your offense, a T for thief, an F for felon, or perhaps some other mark indicating you have fallen far below the accepted moral standard. There is no anesthetic, no mercy, and no opportunity for redress in that instant. The metal meets skin, and in a flash, the pain rips through you. A burning, scorching agony that seems to etch itself into your bones. The physical pain is unbearable, but it is only the beginning of the punishment. Long after the heat has subsided, and the wound begins to scab, the true torment unfolds in the days, months, and years that follow. The brand you bear is a visible scar that no one can ignore. It serves as an ever-present reminder not only to you, but to every member of your community that you have transgressed against the social order. You cannot hide your past. It walks ahead of you wherever you go. In the marketplace, while others haggle over prices or exchange greetings, whispers follow you. Strangers glance at your marked skin and exchange knowing looks. Employers, wary of any association with disgrace, may refuse to hire you. Even friends and family may begin to distance themselves, fearing that your very presence will taint their own reputation. The shame that accompanies the physical mark is immeasurable. For many, it results in a profound internal isolation, a psychological prison from which there is no escape. Every time you look at your exposed skin, you see not only the suffering you endured, but a lifelong contract with disgrace. Social gatherings become unbearable, for you know that even a casual touch might remind someone of your dishonor. Over time, the brand becomes a symbol not just of your criminal act, but of the system that condemned you. A system where even the innocent could be swept up in suspicion and where justice was often a matter of public opinion rather than fairness or truth. For those who were branded, the long-term physical effects could be equally devastating. In many cases, the process of branding left deep wounds that never healed properly. They became prone to infections, scar tissue formed over sensitive areas, and nerves were permanently damaged. These injuries could lead to chronic pain, reduced mobility, and disfigurement far worse than the original mark might have suggested. In a time before modern medicine, even minor infections could turn deadly. Moreover, the constant reminder of pain could lead to debilitating psychological stress, a kind of perpetual trauma that affected every aspect of daily life. Socially, the branded individual was cast out almost immediately. Medieval society placed a heavy premium on honor and reputation, and a brand was proof that you had failed to live up to the community's standards. Neighbors avoided you, and trade opportunities evaporated as soon as your mark was noticed. Many branded individuals were left to eke out a living on the fringes, begging at market stalls, joining bands of outlaws, or migrating to distant regions where the stigma might, if only temporarily, be forgotten. Even then, once word spread of your past, you were forever marked by it. Reputation in the medieval era was not something that could be erased with time or effort. Attempts at reintegration were rare and difficult. Some may have managed to secure a limited amount of work through sheer tenacity or the kindness of a family member willing to overlook your past. But more often than not, the brand dictated your fate as an outcast. The branding punishment was meant to be a deterrent, a public spectacle designed to instill fear in any potential wrongdoer. Every time someone passed by the marketplace or saw a public execution, the branded individuals served as living reminders of the consequences of even minor transgressions. Thus, branding became a tool of social control, reinforcing norms and maintaining order through the constant presence of shame. Yet, for the person who bore the brand, the experience was profoundly dehumanizing. Your identity was no longer your own. It was dictated by that single, seared letter or symbol. One cannot overstate the cruelty of such a punishment. While physical pain might eventually dull, the emotional and social isolation lingered long after the wounds had closed. Many branded individuals became withdrawn, avoiding any situation where their mark might be revealed. They lived in a constant state of fear of being recognized, fear of being ridiculed, fear of not being able to find any semblance of normalcy in a society that had already written them off. This isolation, in many cases, led to a spiral of depression and despair, a self-fulfilling prophecy where the branded person, already ostracized, became even more disconnected from the community that had condemned them. Economic repercussions were equally severe. In a medieval economy that was largely based on personal labor and local trade, reputation was vital. Your brand was a billboard of disgrace that shut you out of the very markets, guilds, and social networks that could provide sustenance. Loans, marriages, apprenticeships, all were contingent on a family's or individual's standing within the community. A branded person was seen as a financial liability, a risky bet with no redeemable qualities. This often forced the branded into a cycle of poverty, where the shame of their past precluded them from any chance at upward mobility. Yet, amid the unrelenting hardship, a few found ways to resist complete desolation. There are rare accounts of branded individuals who managed to reinvent themselves, taking on new identities, moving to far-off regions, or even seeking refuge in the relative anonymity of a larger city. However, such instances were exceptional, more a matter of luck, or extraordinary resilience than of a systematic possibility of redemption. The majority continued to live under the heavy yoke of their punishment, forced to endure both the physical pain of their scars and the ongoing social alienation that came with them. The process of branding also had a ripple effect on the collective conscience of medieval society. As families observed the punishment of one of their members, they too were reminded of their vulnerability. The branding of one member could cast a shadow over an entire lineage, leading to distrust and uncertainty that spanned generations. In this way, the punishment was not isolated to the individual. It became a stain on the family name, affecting prospects and relationships for years, if not decades. The fear of being branded was therefore not limited to those who had committed crimes. It extended to everyone, as the possibility of accidental or mistaken branding was a terror that loomed over every community member. Every glance, every rumor, every whispered conversation in the tavern served as a constant reminder that one misstep could lead to the most irreversible punishment of all. In summary, being branded in medieval times was a punishment that went beyond the immediate agony of the act itself. It was a lifelong sentence that combined physical pain, social ostracism, and economic ruin. It erased the possibility of a normal life, leaving behind only scars, visible or hidden, that served as constant reminders of one's transgression. The experience of branding was so feared that it became one of the most effective tools of social control in medieval society, ensuring that even the promise of physical pain could extend its reach into every aspect of daily life. For the branded, life became an endless struggle to reclaim some semblance of dignity in a world that had already cast them aside. To be banished in medieval Europe was not merely to be exiled from a town or a village. It was to be stripped of your humanity in the eyes of society. A banished man was neither citizen nor foreigner. He was simply unaccounted for, existing in a gray space beyond law and beyond protection. Once declared an outlaw or exiled from your community, the implications were immediate and severe. You had no rights, no recourse, and no legal existence. In many jurisdictions, you could be killed on sight without it being considered murder. You were not just outside the walls of your village. You were outside the moral framework of the world you had once known. It usually began with a sentence from a local magistrate, a baron, or even a mob of townsfolk. The reasons varied. You might have committed theft, heresy, or simply offended someone with more influence. Maybe you hadn't committed a crime at all, but were accused without strong defense. In many cases, people were exiled for debts they couldn't repay or for minor offenses that, over time, became cumulative in the eyes of their neighbors. If you were deemed dangerous, disruptive, or simply inconvenient, exile was the cleanest way to be rid of you without spilling blood in the town square. The authorities simply declared you outlawed, posted notice, and you were gone, pushed out and forgotten. The road away from society was neither literal nor safe. You might leave a walled city through the northern gate in the morning, but where? Would you go after the forest swallowed the main path? There were no welcome signs for outlaws, no inns that catered to the condemned. Every village you approached might already have heard of your name. Word of an outlaw's banishment spread quickly, carried by traveling monks, gossiping merchants, or paid informants. Your face, if known, became something dangerous to show, and soon, even your name could be enough to bring trouble. Life outside the walls was shaped by hunger. The first need you faced was not safety, but sustenance. Forests might have rabbits, or mushrooms, but few knew how to find them without training. Most outlaws did not have survival experience. They were bakers, cobblers, tailors, or former soldiers. Now they were expected to trap, forage, and endure exposure in lands governed not by man, but by weather and instinct. Hunger weakened the body quickly. A single wet night with no shelter could lead to illness. You'd find yourself scraping lichen off rocks, chewing tree bark, or raiding the edges of farmsteads at night just to stay alive. But raiding brought danger. Peasants did not tolerate thieves, and they guarded their food with pitchforks and iron rods. The punishment for stealing grain could still be death, even for someone already banished. If you were caught near a barn at night, the farmer had every right to kill you where you stood. In fact, some lords offered small coin rewards for proof of outlaw deaths. There was incentive not only to drive you off, but to hunt you. The farther you fled, the more your body betrayed you. Blisters turned to infections. Poor water caused sickness. Hunger drained your strength and your mind. Eventually, the idea of surrender might creep in, even if surrender only meant a faster end. And yet, in some corners of the world, outlaws gathered. These were not the bands of merry thieves imagined in ballads, but desperate clusters of human beings united by rejection. In the deep woods, across moors, or in caves above forgotten valleys, outlaw camps formed with rigid rules of their own. Hierarchies emerged. Older outlaws with experience claimed the best shelters, while newcomers were sent to forage, steal, or spy. Trust was rare. A man you shared bread with one day might slit your throat the next for the warmth of your cloak. Knives were always near at hand. Everything was negotiated through fear or usefulness. You were safe only as long as you had value. What value could you offer? Perhaps you could fight. Outlaw bands welcomed those with military experience, especially deserters who had knowledge of local patrol routes or weakly defended villages. A thief who could pick a lock, a healer who knew plants, or a runaway priest who could read maps. These were commodities. Women in these camps were especially vulnerable. Often outnumbered and without protection, they were either absorbed as possessions of powerful men or forced to trade companionship for protection. There was little mercy. Whatever morality existed in the outlaw camp was dictated not by virtue, but by circumstance. Day-to-day life was harsh. Firewood had to be gathered in secret. Smoke, even in winter, risked discovery. Latrines had to be dug. Diseases spread quickly, and hygiene was rarely maintained. Teeth rotted, wounds festered, and fevers killed. There were no herbs for healing, except what could be stolen or foraged. Outlaws didn't pray at chapels. They buried their dead under rock piles and moved on. Names of the fallen were rarely spoken. Weakness was a threat to the group, and mourning was a luxury few could afford. Occasionally, outlaw bands made deals with corrupt landlords or rival towns. They could be hired as mercenaries, poachers, or even assassins. Some lords preferred using exiles for dirty work, collecting debts, burning rivals' fields, or harassing enemy caravans. For a few weeks, outlaws might be paid in food, shelter, or coin, but these arrangements never lasted. The moment they outlived their usefulness, the outlaws were abandoned, or worse, betrayed. Sometimes they were captured and paraded through the very villages they had raided, strung up in wooden cages as warnings to others. Bones of outlaws hung at crossroads for months, the wind moaning through jawbones in the night. And yet, not every outlaw was a killer. Some were victims of injustice, scapegoats, or men and women who spoke the wrong words at the wrong time. A miller who refused to give grain to a noble soldiers. A midwife accused of witchcraft for a stillborn child. A debt-ridden farmer whose crop failed during a dry season. These people became outlaws too. They didn't steal or kill because they wanted to. They did so because society left them no other way to eat. These were the quiet outlaws, the ones who hid alone in creeks or abandoned watchtowers, hoping the world would forget them until they could somehow return. Could you ever return from outlawry? Very rarely. Sometimes, after years, an outlaw might be pardoned if they fought in a war, paid a bribe, or if a new lord took over and declared amnesty. But these cases were uncommon. Most died forgotten, buried in places without names, there, bones unmarked. Others vanished into deeper forests, becoming legends, or worse, stories parents told their children to keep them from wandering too far at night. To be outside the law in the medieval world was to live as prey among predators. You were never truly safe. The forest was not your sanctuary, it was your sentence. Your name faded from records. Your deeds were told by others. You became a shadow, no home, no future, no protection. Every step you took away from civilization was a step deeper into danger, hunger, fear, and silence. To live as an executioner in medieval Europe was to dwell in the shadow of society, always seen, always needed, yet never truly embraced. It was a role born of contradiction, a citizen in service of law, yet never quite a part of the citizenry. A man trusted with the sword, yet distrusted at every tavern table. He stood not with criminals, but not among the righteous either. He belonged to no guild. He dined alone. His home was often at the edge of town, nearest the gallows, furthest from the church. If he walked through a village square, mothers would gather their children away, and merchants would sell to him only when no one else was watching. His coin was accepted, but his hand was not. The road to becoming an executioner rarely began with choice. In many cases, it began with punishment. A convicted man offered his life in exchange for carrying out the sentence of others. For some, this was preferable to the noose. But with that survival came a sentence of a different kind. He was marked forever by the lives he would take. Once the first execution was done, there was no turning back. Word spread. The village knew. The town knew. The stain never faded. Others were born into the role, the son of an executioner inheriting not just his father's blade, but the social exile that came with it. In rare cases, a man might accept the position willingly, usually for the pay or the strange sense of authority it gave. But even then, he quickly learned the price. Training was harsh and informal. There was no school for executioners. Most learned by watching. A father might show his son how to sharpen the blade, how to position the condemned, how to swing cleanly to avoid suffering. Others watched older executioners at work, standing silently at the gallows as the trapdoor creaked open, or holding the axe while the crowd shouted for blood. There were few words exchanged. The first real lesson came with the first execution. It was a brutal introduction, often messy, sometimes botched. Heads did not always fall cleanly. The crowd could turn vicious. It took strength not just in muscle, but in will. The executioner had to remain cold, focused. Emotion was weakness. Hesitation brought shame. Each mistake left echoes in the square and rumors on every tongue. His duties were varied. Beheadings, hangings, burnings, and amputations. Some regions added floggings or brandings. The executioner might also collect dead bodies from the gibbet, bury plague victims, or break criminals on the wheel. Every act of public justice was his to perform, and with every act, his identity sank deeper into the role. No one ever asked how he slept. No one cared. He was seen as a vessel of the state's will, nothing more. Execution days were public rituals, not private reckonings. People gathered early. Children climbed onto barrels. Merchants sold wine and meat pies. A good executioner was expected to deliver not just death, but spectacle. A clean, swift cut could draw praise, even cheers. A slow, botched death brought derision. The crowd was not merciful. If the condemned struggled, if the blade struck bone instead of neck, the people howled. Sometimes they threw rotten vegetables. Some hurled insults not at the criminal, but at the executioner himself, reminding him that he was not truly one of them. When the execution was done, he wiped the blade, said nothing, and walked away. But the stain followed. Some refused to drink from the same cup he had touched. Others whispered rumors that his house was cursed, that his children would grow into monsters, that no priest would bless his table. It wasn't uncommon for executioners to live outside the city gates, in huts or cottages near the burial fields. His wife, if he had one, might be the daughter of another outcast. His children, if allowed into school, sat alone, and yet the law depended on him. Nobles who dined in velvet halls needed men like him to enforce their verdicts. Magistrates who wore fine robes sent him letters, not invitations. When rebellion threatened, he was summoned without hesitation. When a noblewoman's maid was caught stealing, or a rival lord's spy was uncovered, it was he who delivered the sentence. He saw the faces of the condemned up close, begging, praying, cursing. Sometimes they were guilty. Other times they were simply in the way of power. There were moments of guilt and moments of numbness. Some executioners drank heavily. Others withdrew into silence. A few found strange comfort in their role, embracing it as divine duty or fate. But even they could not escape the toll. The eyes of the dead stayed with them. The screams lingered. In the ear, the smell of blood and fear was never far. Some began to talk to themselves. Some carved tallies on walls. Some took to the forests and never returned. His tools were both instruments and burdens. The axe had to be kept sharp, not just to kill efficiently, but to avoid shame. A dull blade could turn a clean beheading into a nightmare. Some executioners used swords, others long knives or hatchets. Each had their ritual, oiling the metal, whispering a prayer, testing the balance. The rope had to be knotted correctly for hangings. Too short, and the neck wouldn't break. Too long, and the condemned could be decapitated. Mistakes lived longer. Then success. People remembered when the head didn't fall, he had no guild, no union, no brotherhood. Sometimes, executioners in neighboring cities met in secret. They exchanged tools, warnings, techniques. But these meetings were rare and dangerous. If discovered, they might be blamed for collusion, or worse, seen as conspiring. One executioner might hear of another's disgrace, a botched beheading, a lost hand in a sword duel, a suicide. It was a lonely profession. There were no feasts, no laurels, no gratitude. He could not retire easily. Few executioners lived long. The work was punishing, both in spirit and in reputation. If he grew old, his hands shook. His aim faltered. Some begged to be released from duty. Few were. One might train a son or apprentice, passing down the burden. Like a cursed heirloom, others disappeared. A few changed names and wandered, but the whispers always followed. Once an executioner, always one. If he died suddenly, his body was often buried quickly, without procession. The town would find another. They always did. Justice had to be served. Someone had to swing the axe. Someone had to cut the rope. Someone had to face the condemned and not look away, and no matter how much he was hated, he was never forgotten. His presence was a constant reminder that law had a price and someone had to pay it. Not just the condemned, but also the one who delivered the blow. In the end, the executioner died like many he had killed, alone, unseen, and unmourned. In medieval Europe, justice wasn't quietly carried out behind thick stone walls or in closed courtrooms. It unfolded in the open, on gallows hills, market squares, or crossroads, under the watching eyes of neighbors, travelers, and the curious. The law wasn't just a matter of right and wrong. It was theater. And the people? They came in droves. They came not just to see justice done, but to feel something: vindication, excitement, fear, superiority. Sometimes they came to scream. Sometimes they came to laugh. But they always came. Death and pain, dressed in the robes of order, drew bigger crowds than coronations. In execution day was announced early. Word traveled by mouth, horn, or herald. The townspeople knew the signs. The gallows were cleaned. The square was cleared. Soldiers sharpened pikes and posted notices. The condemned might be paraded through town the night before, sometimes dragged, sometimes forced to walk barefoot in chains. If the sentence was branding, flogging, hanging, or worse, burning, everyone knew. The taverns buzzed. The farmers adjusted their schedules. Merchants stocked up. Parents debated whether to bring their children, not out of concern, but to teach them, to show them the cost of theft, of heresy, of speaking out of turn. They arrived early, peasants and nobles alike. Vendors set up near the scaffold. Pies, nuts, hot wine. The scent of roasting meat mixed with the scent of fear and sweat. Children wove between legs, lifting their heads to catch a glimpse of the platform. Some climbed onto barrels or carts for a better view. Musicians sometimes played. Pickpockets worked the edges. For many, this was the most excitement they'd see all season. And then the condemned arrived, sometimes carried in a cart, bound at the wrists. Sometimes forced to walk, bruised from interrogation, eyes hollow from days without sleep. Some prayed, aloud. Some spat at the crowd. Others wept, sang, or laughed manically. One could never predict how a man would face death. Not until he stood on the scaffold. The crowd wanted a show. They wanted a villain. If the condemned had wronged someone, local, stolen from the church, murdered a landowner's son, spoken out against the wrong noble, the crowd seethed. Rocks were thrown. Rotten vegetables flew. Children chanted insults their parents had taught them. But if the condemned seemed too young, too frail, too quiet, sometimes a hush fell. Sympathy wasn't expected, but it wasn't impossible. A woman about to be hanged for theft might draw tears. A boy condemned for stealing bread might cause even the toughest farmer to avert his eyes, but sympathy faded quickly. The executioner climbed the steps. A man with no name, no greeting, just an axe, just a rope, just a torch. The punishment was read aloud. Sometimes a priest offered last rites. Sometimes he was heckled. The condemned might confess or beg. Sometimes they were gagged. Some used their last breath to curse the town. Others tried to sing hymns through cracked lips. The crowd drank it all in. If it was a hanging, the crowd watched the body struggle, feet kicking, tongue bulging. It was not quick. It was not clean. Children watched. Some laughed. Others wept silently, hiding behind aprons. If it was a beheading, the executioner raised his blade. If he struck true, a cheer might rise. If he failed, the crowd turned. They threw stones. They screamed insults. Once or twice, executioners had to flee under guard. Burnings were more elaborate. A stake, bound hands, dry wood. Fire didn't take quickly. The condemned screamed. The crowd leaned in. Smoke choked the front rows. But they didn't move back. They wanted to see. They had walked miles for this moment. They had brought their children to teach them obedience. But the spectacle didn't end with death. Bodies were left to hang for days. Heads were placed on spikes at city gates. Crows gathered. The smell of rot settled into the air. And still, people came to look. Some prayed. Others made jokes. A few touched the scaffold, believing it held power. The townsfolk remembered each execution vividly. They told the stories to guests. They pointed out the spots. That's where the baker's boy was flogged. That post. There. That's where they burned the heretic. It became part of the town's identity. Sometimes justice turned chaotic. A crowd might riot, either out of rage at a perceived injustice or bloodlust gone too far. A condemned man might be torn from the guards and beaten before the sentence was carried out. In a few infamous moments, the crowd overruled the judge. They demanded death. They pulled men from wagons. Lynchings happened, even under the eyes of law. Once, in a German village, the people stoned a woman accused of witchcraft before the priest could arrive. No one was punished. It was called the will of the people. There was a strange pride in brutality. The more public, the better. The more violent, the more remembered. Lords held executions during festivals to entertain guests. Cities competed. For reputation, we burn faster, they bragged. We hang higher. Inquisitors wrote about crowd reactions in reports. The people were well pleased. The sentence was met with applause. Justice was not private. It was political theater. Even lesser punishments became events. Brandings, floggings, ear clippings. A thief whipped in the square drew crowds almost as large. Blood flew. The whip cracked. Every lash was counted aloud. If the man cried out, the people smiled. If he stayed silent, they muttered. Once the punishment was over, he was pushed into the street, marked, bleeding, alive, but not whole. Over time, authorities learned to use the crowd. A ruler seeking power staged executions of rivals in front of thousands. A bishop punishing heresy made it theatrical to assert control. The public punishment of the body became a way to govern the mind. The people saw what happened to traitors. They remembered. Fear replaced law. Pain became policy. But what did it do to the crowd? How did it shape a child to watch his neighbor hanged? How did it affect a woman to see a girl her age set aflame? No one asked. No one considered trauma. It was simply the way of the world. You obeyed, or you ended up on the platform. Those who watched too often either grew numb or began to enjoy it. Sadism passed as tradition. A boy who laughed at the gallows became a man who brought his son to do the same. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the crowds only grew. Print culture added to the frenzy. Pamphlets about crimes were sold before the executions. Ballads were written. Woodcuts printed. People arrived with expectations. He deserves more than hanging, one might say. I heard they'll break him on the wheel. Rumors stoked anticipation. The executioner became both villain and performer. But there were exceptions. Not every town cheered. In some places, after too many deaths, the crowd grew quiet. A woman might scream alone in the crowd. A priest might protest. A child might cry, uncontrollably. These moments were rare, but they existed. Even the bloodthirsty crowd had limits. When a condemned man cried out that he was innocent, some turned away. When a woman was burned for witchcraft without evidence, a few in the back whispered doubts. But it changed nothing. The sentence was passed. The fire was lit. The crowd moved on. Medieval justice was never just about guilt. It was about order, obedience, fear. And fear works better when people can see it happen. That was the true power of the spectacle. It was not just punishment, it was performance. The condemned were actors in a morality play. The crowd? They were the audience. And the state was the playwright. Over time, the rituals became more codified. There were execution days, set times on calendars. Some towns published schedules. Punishment became routine. The square was washed after each death. The scaffold rebuilt. Children grew up watching pain. Merchants sold food beside the rope. And no one questioned it, because questioning it meant stepping closer to the scaffold. It begins with the clang of the gate. The dungeon is not a place built for the passage of time. It is built to deny it. Down narrow stairwells and behind rusted iron grates lies a space deliberately forgotten by those above. You do not enter a dungeon as punishment. You enter it to disappear. If medieval justice was often public and theatrical, the dungeon was its opposite. Hidden, stagnant, and mercilessly silent. And unlike the popular myths, prisons in the medieval world were not typically meant for long-term punishment. Most accused people were either fined, mutilated, whipped, exiled, or killed. Prisons were a waiting room for death, ransom, confession, or worse. They were also a business. And you paid for everything. As the door shut behind you, the first thing you noticed was not the dark. It was the wet. The walls weep. Constantly. Stone soaked in centuries of moisture. It drips from the ceiling in uneven intervals, sometimes over your face as you lie there. Mold grows in patches you can smell, but not see. The floor is often not flat, but uneven stone or hard-packed earth, slimy from decay, riddled with rat droppings and the remains of old straw. Lice are everywhere. Fleas find you within hours. If you're shackled, your wrists and ankles will bleed within a day. If you're not, you will wish you were when the others wake up, because the dungeon is not empty. There are others, faces in the dark, indistinguishable at first. They do not speak to you. Not yet. Most are too far gone in mind or too cautious to trust. Some mutter to themselves. Some simply stare. In some dungeons, you might be alone for days. Your only company the scurrying of rats and the distant groan of wood shifting under stone. The stench is overwhelming. There is no toilet, just a corner, sometimes a bucket, never cleaned. If you're lucky, there's a drain built into the floor, but it's just as often clogged with human waste or thick sludge. Prisoners relieve themselves where they sit. The smell becomes part of the air, part of your skin. After a few hours, you stop noticing. But it never stops seeping in. You sleep on damp straw or directly on stone. Your clothes rot on your body. If you're imprisoned for more than a few days, your feet begin to swell. Ulcers form. Open wounds attract insects. You scratch without thinking until you're bleeding. Every motion hurts. And there is no relief. There is no schedule, no routine, no light to mark morning or evening. You sleep when your body fails, and you wake when your hunger gnaws deep enough to stir you. In some castles, a tiny hole near the ceiling lets in a shaft of light, but only for a few hours a day. It doesn't help you tell time. It only reminds you the world still exists outside. Food, if you can call it that, is brought irregularly. A crust of black bread, a bowl of porridge, swarming with weevils, maybe a thin soup with the flavor of rot. Water is cloudy, sometimes mossy. You drink it anyway. Hunger wins. A few dungeons charge for better meals, but only if you had silver when you arrived. Most don't. The guards come rarely. When they do, it's not for your benefit. Some are just bored. They throw insults, spit on prisoners, poke through the bars with torches or sticks. Others are crueler, amused by pain. A guard might demand a confession for a crime you didn't commit. Refuse, and you're hauled up the stairs, not to leave, but to meet the torturer. The torture chamber is not far from the dungeon. Often, it's just above or beside it for convenience. The devices used vary by region and imagination. The rack, which pulls limbs slowly apart. The thumbscrew, which crushes fingers. The strappado, which drops you suddenly from a height with arms tied behind your back, dislocating shoulders in one violent jerk. Heated tongs, iron boots, a pair of anguish. All were used at different times and places. Few died during torture. That was not the goal. The goal was confession. Words, names, information. It didn't matter if it was true. Once done, you were dragged back to the dungeon. Bruised, bleeding, sometimes screaming. The others did not ask what happened. They already knew. You slept again, if sleep could come through the pain. Some prisoners never left the dungeon. Trials could be delayed for weeks, months, even years, especially if you were poor. The wealthy could sometimes buy their way out, or bribe a guard, or pay a ransom. You could also pay for better conditions, a blanket, more food, a candle, even your own cell. Those without coins simply rotted. Inquisition dungeons were even worse. There, prisoners were often held in total silence. The cells were soundproofed by thick stone and lined with metal, preventing even whispers. Talking was forbidden. Isolation was used as a weapon. You could spend weeks without hearing another voice, going slowly mad in the darkness. Many did. The walls were sometimes scratched with names, prisoners trying to leave behind some mark of their existence. In some cells, the walls were carved deeply with tally marks. Days counted, or perhaps just attempts to stay sane. But in many dungeons, prisoners lacked even that strength. Their minds folded inward. They forgot their names. They stopped moving. Disease spread quickly. Lice, dysentery, typhus. Wounds festered. Skin rotted. Coughs echoed endlessly. There were no doctors, no medicine. If a prisoner died, the body might be removed the next morning or left to rot for days. Rats came in numbers, bloated and fearless. They gnawed at feet while prisoners slept. They fought over scraps and corpses. Some prisoners fought back with sticks. Others didn't bother. The hopelessness became a physical thing. You could feel it in the walls, in your chest, in your spine. It pressed down on you, whispering that no one was coming, that nothing you did mattered. Some tried to pray, but even prayer felt like shouting into a well. God seemed far away beneath stone. There were no clocks, no calendars. Time ceased to move. A man might believe he'd been in for 3 days, when it had been 12. Another might think he'd been forgotten for years, when it was just weeks. Madness crept in like mold. Some dungeons had windows high above, just enough to let in a flicker of moonlight. Others were buried deep below castles or city walls, with no view of the sky. One famous French cell held prisoners for so long in utter blackness that they forgot what light looked like. When one was finally released, he covered his eyes and screamed at the sun. Escape was nearly impossible. Guards knew the layout. Keys were rare and tightly guarded. The architecture itself was designed to confuse spirals, false passages, pit traps. Even if you somehow reached the outer doors, you faced drawbridges, guards, and town watchmen. Only a handful of recorded prison escapes ever succeeded, and most ended with recapture. For some, execution was a mercy, but not all dungeons ended in death. Some prisoners were released after confessions, fines, or bargains, but the damage was done. Men who left the dungeon were not the same as those who entered. They were thinner, paler, eyes darting, limbs twisted, minds broken. Some never spoke again. Others told wild, fragmented stories. Few were believed. Even fewer were welcomed back. The dungeon was not simply a place to hold people. It was a tool of control, a weapon against rebellion, heresy, treason, or disobedience. It existed not to correct, but to erase. It told the people outside, "We can do this, and no one will ask why." And perhaps most chilling, no one did. It's the middle of the night, and your eyes snap open that you're not sure what woke you. There is no sound in the cottage, only the slow creaking of timber above and the low moan of wind outside the shuttered window. But your chest feels tight. There's a weight on it. Something cold clutches at your ribs. You try to breathe, to move, but your limbs are frozen. You want to scream, but your voice is locked behind your teeth. You are not alone. You have just encountered what medieval people feared more than death itself: the visit of a night demon, a spirit, or a curse made flesh. In modern times, we call this sleep paralysis. But in the medieval world, it had many names, and none of them harmless. Dreams were not random in the minds of medieval people. They were messages. Dreams could be signs from God, temptations from the devil, visitations from the dead, or prophetic visions of events yet to unfold. They weren't simply a part of sleep. They were sleep's purpose. And nightmares? Those weren't just bad dreams. They were warnings, punishments, curses that in medieval Europe. The line between sleep and spiritual vulnerability was thin. People believed that while the body rested, the soul wandered. In dreams, a person might speak with angels or be tormented by demons. They could receive divine instruction or be led astray into temptation. Sleep was not peaceful. It was dangerous. The hours after sunset were considered the devil's playground. Many believed that. During the night, evil spirits roamed freely. The term nightmare itself comes from the Old English mare, a kind of demonic being that would sit on a sleeper's chest, suffocating them with invisible weight. These weren't figures of imagination. They were feared as real beings. Accounts of people seeing witches, hags, or shadowy figures crouched atop their chests are recorded across centuries. Today, we call them hallucinations caused by interrupted REM sleep. Then, they were taken as evidence that someone had been cursed, that the devil was near, that someone in the village, an old widow, perhaps, or an herbalist, was using dark powers. And it wasn't just the experience of sleep paralysis that haunted people. Dreams themselves were dissected with a seriousness we now reserve for medical symptoms. A recurring dream could send someone to a priest or to a wise woman. Did you dream of a river? It might symbolize your soul's journey. Did you see a storm? An omen of violence or upheaval. A dog could represent loyalty or betrayal. A burning house might mean death was approaching. There were books written to interpret these dreams. One of the most influential was the Somnial Danielles, a popular medieval dream manual often copied and passed between monasteries and literate nobles. In it, dreams were cataloged much like medicinal herbs, each with meaning, each with potential danger, but interpretation wasn't just the business of monks. Across Europe, local cunning folk, midwives, and seers read dreams as they might read the stars or the shape of bones in a fire. If you dreamed of blood, they might advise a purification ritual. If you dreamed of flying, they might warn you to stay indoors the next full moon. The dream wasn't just a private event. It could become a community concern. Dreams could even be used as evidence in court. There are recorded cases from 13th to 15th century England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire in which someone claimed to have been accused or guided by a dream. A person might claim that a saint visited them in their sleep, instructing them to build a church or accuse a heretic. Others were accused because someone else dreamed of them harming livestock or children in a world where divine judgment was considered real and active. To dream of someone's sin was almost the same as witnessing it. This fear extended into how people prepared for sleep. Before bed, many prayed specific prayers of protection. Some wrote short verses and placed them under pillows. Others hung amulets or relics near the bed. A splinter of wood said to be from the true cross, a piece of parchment with the Lord's Prayer, or a pouch filled with herbs believed to ward off evil spirits. Iron was thought to repel demons. So, were bells. Some beds had small metal charms hidden in their frames. Infants were especially vulnerable. They were often given cradle protection rituals, where holy words were whispered into their ears before they slept. Parents feared that the devil might steal a baby in the night and replace it with a changeling, a creature that looked like their child, but was cold, strange, and inhuman. Nightmares weren't always blamed on demons. Sometimes they were thought to come from indigestion or vapors rising from the stomach to the head. Physicians might prescribe certain foods or prohibit others before sleep. Cheese, beans, onions, and even fish were said to cause troubling dreams. Some doctors advised that one sleep with their head pointed north and their feet south to avoid disturbances. Others said you should never sleep on your back, as that posture invited spirits to visit. But if a person suffered the same nightmare again and again, that was different. That wasn't food. That was fate. Recurring dreams, especially of fire, falling, drowning, or someone already dead, were treated with grave seriousness. In monastic communities, brothers would sometimes be isolated or placed under supervision if they reported a particularly vivid or disturbing dream. It was thought that such dreams might be a sign of spiritual attack, or worse, possession in the homes of common folk. Such fears often ended in candles being burned all night, or holy water being sprinkled across the threshold. In more extreme cases, neighbors might call on a priest to bless the house, or on a wise woman to identify the source of the curse. If livestock began to die or food spoiled soon after, the person who dreamed might be blamed as the cause. There are even records of dream-induced accusations leading to executions. In 1445, a woman in the Rhineland was hanged after her neighbor claimed to have dreamt 3 nights in a row of her consorting with demons. The dream included details the accuser could not have known. It was taken as supernatural proof. No evidence was presented at trial. None was needed. Why were dreams taken so seriously? Because the medieval world was full of uncertainty. Life was short, violent, and unpredictable. Disease, famine, and war struck without warning. In the absence of reliable science, dreams were seen as messages from a realm beyond, clues from God or the devil about dangers yet unseen. To ignore them was to ignore your only chance at protection. And so, people feared the night, not only for what it held, but for what it revealed. You went to bed not knowing if you would wake. You wrapped yourself in prayer. You shielded your mind with symbols. You trusted that your dreams would be kind, and if they weren't, that you would have the wisdom to understand them, or the luck to survive them. Because in the medieval night, sleep wasn't rest, it was exposure. So, what really happened if you got arrested in the Middle Ages? It wasn't just about guilt or innocence. It wasn't about rights, or representation, or a fair shot at justice. It was about survival, about status, about luck, sometimes about whether your accuser had louder friends than you did. Once arrested, you didn't wait for a lawyer. You waited in chains, in the dark, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes forever. Your guilt might be assumed the moment you were seized, or you might be tortured until you confessed. Whether you did it or not, if you were poor, your odds were worse. If you were foreign, they were lower still. Trials could be decided by combat, or by water, or by fire, because to many, God would reveal the truth through suffering. And if he didn't, then maybe your corpse would. And yet, medieval justice wasn't always cruel for cruelty's sake. In its own way, it was a system trying to hold chaos back, to preserve order, to keep fear in check. It reflected the values of the time: faith, obedience, hierarchy, and did what it could with the tools it had: superstition, fear, public shame, and power. Looking back, it's easy to judge. But for those who lived it, justice was just another kind of storm. Sometimes you survived it. Sometimes it swallowed you whole. So, what really happened if you got arrested? You hoped your name was known. You hoped someone would speak for you. And above all, you prayed the night before your sentence. Because no matter what came next, you knew mercy rarely knocked twice. Thank you for watching. If this held your attention, like the video, subscribe for more history that doesn't sugarcoat the past, and leave a comment about what topic you'd like us to explore next. Until then, stay out of trouble.